And we are now approaching almost the end. Our last talk. Harvey, will you give it by yourself or with your partner?
Hi, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here.
So would you please introduce the talk yourself?
Yeah, I will. Thank you. Thank you, Haim. I will be giving my presentation alone. So normally we would have presented the two of us. I'm working as a professor in German Jewish literature in Antwerp and in Brussels. And my partner, so normally Annelies, she is doing a PhD under my supervision on Willy Kohn's diaries, and I will be telling something about him right away. So I will be sharing my screen with you. Just a moment. I hope you can. Yeah,
yes, we can.
Okay, great. So my talk will be from the perspective of literary studies. So I'm not a historian. I work in literature, but with a focus on Holocaust diaries and also autobiographies, but mainly diaries. So I will be talking about Jewish ego documents as a genre and as a source. Okay. So well, I will start here. So whereas autobiographies or memoirs are memory-driven narratives forcibly oblivious of the details of quotidian life, diaries are particularly successful in rendering the ephemeral character of the everyday existence, as they function as quasi-instantaneous recordings of the talk of the street. The diary is a first-person account, but the strict adherence to the diarist's empirical observations of day-to-day events and issues, along with the lapidary style of writing, gives diary writing a representative stature that is in many cases both personal and collective. So in this context, a strictly biographical methodology needs to be avoided. Accordingly, diaries can be read as texts which shift the demands for authenticity traditionally attached to this genre from the truthful subject to the truth of writing itself. Autobiographical accounts must be understood not so much as an exact representation of the self or reproduction of personal life experience, but rather as an instrument or medium for its creation, as a strategy of the self-technique. So in literary studies, so the very act of writing is focused on. The strategy of constructing the self through writing, through language, is what is at the center of a literary approach in diary writing. So therefore, one can say that the diary is situated on the borderline, of course, between historiography and autobiography, and can be addressed by both literary scholars and historians, of course. This is, or this tension is addressed by Irina Paperno when she writes, scholars, literary specialists, and historians can be judged based on their ability to deal with diaries, which calls for attention to the form or genre, context, and individual subject simultaneously. So this is from a themed issue in the Russian Review about diaries. from a historical and a literary perspective. So it would thus appear that for Irene Paperno, in the above quote, diaries might be considered a kind of litmus test for the quality of historians and literary specialists. Yet this quote goes beyond that, implying that with regard to the diary as object, there is no meaningful difference between the study of diaries in literary studies and in history. It is incumbent upon both disciplines to address issues of form, genre, context, and content. Therefore, the genre can be considered a hybrid textual form which can be claimed and analyzed in quite different and often opposing ways by both disciplines. From a historical point of view, for example, in everyday history, Alltagsgeschichte, the diary can be seen as a factitious but highly subjective document, whereas in literature, the textual and narrative structure, as well as the identity construction of the writing subject, are highlighted. Which metaphors are used, which stylistic figures are used, which images, symbols are used. So this specific mode of writing exemplifies the hermeneutic circle of private and collective history, in that the macro-historical perspective of major historical events and dates sheds an important light on the micro-historical account of the individual's experience, and vice versa. Its daily mode of writing allows for prolific accumulation of historical details. And this, of course, we have already seen during the conference, which turns the journal into a valuable archive of personally experienced everyday Jewish life. So in this context, special methodological attention will be paid to German Jewish diaries. And I mean, I only have 20 minutes, but I would like to say something about Willy Cohn's diaries from Breslau. And also, if I have the time, something more about Victor Klemperer from Dresden. So in their diaries, the experiences of physical and verbal violence on the streets give rise to reflections on the nature of anti-Semitism, the degree of support of National Socialism within the German population, and a radical renegotiation of the relation between Jewish and German inhabitants. Their diaries also represent, as I have already said, a kind of micrological archive of daily life in Breslau and in Dresden, in which information on the availability of food, inner city mobility, restrictions on the purchase of clothing, tobacco, and a precise chronicle of the loss of civic rights, etc. The authors endeavored to collect these, at first sight, seemingly unimportant details to record what has been said, what circulated in their time. So the first part in my presentation will shed more light on the textual status of the Jewish diary during National Socialism, and identify its basic features as a textual genre and a historical source. The second section will elaborate on the different methods literary theory and historiography can adopt to analyze from different angles the diary as a genre in general, as well as Cohn's and Klemperer's diaries in particular. So, just a moment. So this is the diary by Willy Cohn. I will be telling something about him right away. So the Breslau diaries and Victor Klemperer's diaries, so from Dresden. In fact, two major diaries from Jewish German diaries during National Socialism. I know Klemperer best I have also written a book on his diaries. So, diary as a genre and as a source. So from my perspective, there is still a clear divide between these two branches of scholarship. Historians tend to be inevitably skeptical about the validity of diaries as a representation of reality, claiming that they do not lend themselves to generalization, not with regard to the purpose for which they are kept, and even less so in terms of the author's social backgrounds. Nevertheless, as Janos Steurer and Rüdiger Graf argue in Selbstreflexion und Weltdeutungen, Tagebücher in der Geschichte und der Geschichtsschreibung des 20. Jahrhunderts, there is certainly room for systematically exploring the relationship of the individual to history. What's more, diaries invite to contemplate representations of the past, of course. For their part, literary scholars believe historians have insufficient appreciation for the diary form. While the spontaneous, often daily notation imposes a particular closeness to what is being described, this closeness may admittedly complicate its use as a historical source. Because of the immediacy of the facts, diaries are full of unsubstantiated claims, or in the case of war diaries, full of rumors and rhetorical questions. Editing processes involved in publication exacerbate the problem of using diaries as a source. The diary, nevertheless, has a versatility, which is one of its defining genre characteristics that facilitates consideration of all the aspects of daily life from both a critical literary and historical perspective. Jochen Helbeck describes the tension between the two disciplines, literary studies and historiography, as a frustration emanating from both sides. He writes, quote, "In terms of its genre features and as a historical source, the diary has bedeviled literary and historical scholars alike. Its uncertain nature between literary writing, between fictional and documentary, spontaneous and reflected narrative has frustrated many a literary specialist in search for canonical clarity. At least equally frustrating has it proved for historians to work with the diary's personal testimony, which promises sincere private testimony, yet which at closer sight reveals manifold connections to conventions governing the public world." So while literary and historical studies still do not appear to be entirely on the same track, they do share commonalities in terms of arguing that it is time to treat the self and the world that emerge from diaries not as something predetermined, expressed with immediacy and authenticity, but as something created through the text itself and unearthed by the reader. Both disciplines warn that there is no such thing as unmediated access to experience and facts. In literary studies, the diary is thus placed in its communicative situation, seen as a pragmatic speech act. More specifically, literary scholars often focus on rhetorical strategies. At the same time, this discourse has also increasingly become part of historical analysis. As occurs in literary studies, communicative context plays an important role in historical studies. Though the historical context is often defined more broadly, so it is so as to identify patterns. Finally, historical and literary analysis are converging in their interest in the diaries of ordinary people. Literary research into the diary has long been dominated by the study of diaries of famous writers, for example, or prominent cultural historical figures. Aesthetic quality and cultural value were what mattered. Since the emergence of the oral history in the 1970s and everyday history in the 80s, however, diaries of ordinary people have become a growing object of research, given that these documents can provide insight into such areas as life world, or the environment, or the identity of the author from a micro-historical perspective. So diaries present themselves as a rigid, almost ritualized form of self-control and meticulous bookkeeping in regard to one's life. They are both a site of self-observation, self-description, and self-interpretation, and a medium for constructing identity. The diary occupies a specific position between past and present, between self and other, between public realm and private sphere. Even when the diary is no longer strictly secret, it still continues to imitate secrecy. The subject narrates its experience to itself, organizing it in stories. This is already the above quote I already quoted. In a quote by Catherine Zederberg, she writes, "Diaries want to be able to narrate, to plot their lives, but they cannot. It is important that these stories appear in the plural, as the life story is not a stable construct, but rather a work in progress." Philippe Lejeune, a famous scholar working in autobiography studies, therefore characterized the diary as brouillon de soi, as a provisional concept of the self. And as far back as 2004, Hellbeck, I already quoted him, programmatically prioritized that complementarity with regard to future research, stating that only a combined application of literary and historical tools of analysis can disclose a multidimensional literary and extra-literary notion of self in a personal document. So now in the last part of this short presentation, I would like to introduce Willy Cohn. And as I said, if I have some time left, say something about Victor Klemperer. These diaries, so the diaries by Willy Cohn and Victor Klemperer, bear witness to everyday Jewish life under the Nazi regime and lay bare the tension between subordination and the tactical reappropriation of their lives. They are important sources of daily life in Breslau and Dresden. The diary offered them a common medium for intensive reflection on both the self and its environment. So, who was Willy Cohn? Very briefly, I think Cohn is considered one of the major German Jewish diarists, and mainly because of his diary documenting life in Breslau. So you can see a number of pictures here with in the middle, on the left, in the middle his wife Trudi, Gertrud, and his two youngest children, and Willy Cohn and Trudi below. You can see them there. So he's known for his presentation of daily life on the National Socialism in Breslau. He was born in 1888, and he was a teacher and a historian. He raised 5 children and was able to save 3 of them from Nazi Germany. In November 1941, the 2 youngest children were sent to Kaunas in Lithuania together with their parents, with him and Gertrud, where they were murdered. The diary ends in 1941. The diary is a compensation space for Cohn for the loss of previous communication places, replacing conversations that they engaged in every day on the street. Moreover, one could say that keeping a diary for him, and we can see the same thing in, for example, Klemperer's diaries, and they have done some research on Willy Tauch's diary also from Breslau. Diary is a kind of tactic in the way that Michel de Certeau talks about strategies and tactics. On the one hand, writing is important as a survival tactic. Here you can see, I forgot to show you this picture too. On the left-hand side, you can see Willy Cohn as a teacher in the Johannes Gymnasium in Breslau. So he writes in 1941 with regard to the importance of his diary. He writes, "It sometimes seems stupid that I also write the little things in this book, but often my strength to live and work depends on it." I'm very interested in this meta discourse, in the way the diary is presented, is described. On the other hand, the diarists oppose themselves to the anti-Semitic propaganda. National Socialist propaganda submerges the public space as a triumph of totalitarianism. The diarist, for his part, conceives his writing as a kind of triumph against tyranny, when the aim of the National Socialist was to obscure that what was really happening to the Jewish population. The diaries are written in a state of urgency to oppose the National Socialist triumph. Here you can see a manuscript page from 1940 from Billy Korn. And already in 1938 he writes, "I often write in this book now. If it should survive the times, it will perhaps one day tell later generations what a Jewish person lived and suffered during this time. Everything is in turmoil. There are catastrophes everywhere." And these kinds of notes you can find everywhere in every diary. The importance of bearing witness. So linked to this function of the diary as chronicle or proof of the situation, the authors endeavor to collect these, sometimes common details or everyday details to record what has been said. And therefore, diaries cannot exclusively be seen as self-centered intimate diaries, of course, but rather as tools for cultural analysis. What a diary characterizes is sometimes hard to tell, since everyone can use it as they wish. This is also what Hélène Camarade, a French scholar also working in literary studies, who is specialized in German Jewish diaries, states when trying to provide a definition of the genre. She writes, I've translated the quote from French. "Among autobiographical texts, the diary has the particularity of being a multifaceted genre characterized by its open and evolving forms. Only a few formal criteria make it possible to define it. It is a relationship written over a certain period of time, which is characterized by dated and regular entries, but of fairly variable frequency, and in which the temporal gap between the experience and its narration is minimal. Each diarist can use his or her diary as he or she sees fit according to his or her objectives or needs. Similarly, he or she can change the implicit rules of writing at any time." This becomes very clear in Korn's diary. It catches the eye that his writing process changes as the Second World War approaches. Whereas at the beginning of the diary, he retreated into himself and focused on himself, his work as a historian and his family before the war, after he became aware of the fact that Jewish Breslauers did not belong to the urban fabric anymore. With the outbreak of the war, his diary writing changes. He becomes highly interested in the war situation and writes down every detail of the world situation as meticulously as possible, no longer limiting himself to personal information. From the moment he becomes aware that the war is approaching, his notes even start to follow a fixed pattern. Usually, he first gives information about himself and what he did, then he refers to the newspapers and the political situation. We could say he provides a future reader or an imaginative reader with micro and macro information, history. He also adds information that is not provided by the newspapers as to counter the one-sided view of National Socialism. This change in his writing can be exemplified in the following way, and this is a typical pattern of his diary notes. So kind of, well, a structured narrativity, yeah, with personal information, reference to the political situation, and again the diaristic meta discourse. So a description of the writing process. Why am I writing? For whom am I writing? And what we can see, for example, with Victor Klemperer, is that the diary becomes a kind of it's just more than just a paper. It becomes a kind of ersatz of the body, which is extremely important to survive, to bear witness for future generations. So references to newspapers appear very often, which was not the case before the war, when they only occurred occasionally. One can say that the war changes the focus of the diarist, and therefore also the way of writing. The diary is shaped during the writing process itself. This shift gives insights into the forms and functions the diarists ascribe to this medium. At the core of I don't know if I still have time.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. So I can have a few more minutes to conclude with some information on Klemperer. So Klemperer, of course, the famous German Jewish professor of French literature in Dresden. Also known for his language critical work on the language of the Third Reich, LTI. At the core of Klemperer's diaries is the moral will to reproduce as precisely as possible the proliferating dehumanization in the Third Reich. In spite of the dangers involved, his sense of duty towards his chronicle and the act of writing in general is his categorical imperative. He writes, always the same seesaw, the fear that my scribbling could get me put into a concentration camp, the feeling that it is my duty to write, that it is my life's task, my calling. He writes in an entry, this is 27th of May 1942, or a bit before, one is murdered for lesser misdemeanors, but I shall go on writing. This is my heroism. I will bear witness, precise witness. The duty to bear witness felt by Klemperer is a moral requirement, obliging him as a witness of the National Socialist crime against humanity to record the suffering of the Jewish community, which he himself not only observed, but also experienced personally. In this context, we could follow Dory Lob in emphasizing that trauma always involves the moral duty to testify and to remember. In spite of all the uncertainty as to whether he will ever be able to continue keeping record, this is precisely what Klemperer hopes for. He writes also in the beginning of 1942, I would like to be the chronicler of the cultural history of the present catastrophe, observing to the last, taking notes without asking whether the utilization of the notes will lead to something worthwhile again. Not only did the daily expenditure of time and energy, Klemperer's entries were often made in a state of extreme tiredness, overwork, illness, bears witness to this belief. It is even more clearly confirmed by the concern that the continued existence of the I, of the self, was proliferating over the years. So to conclude, diary writing can be seen as a complex strategy of self-construction. It is, however, not only strategy as an expression of personal intentionality, but also a cultural technique for the production of identity. The autobiographical reliance on the speaking I and the presumed identity between the speaker and actor reveals its involvement with subjectivity and self-construction through the performative act of writing. These diaries highlight a number of tensions that ultimately reflect on the disjunction between living and writing. The divide between a single and changing self lies at the heart of these diaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much.